Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the watch. Peter Heinlein was a German locksmith turned monk. He arguably made the first watch. It was a clock small enough that could be hung on a rope around the neck. As you can see, it does not look anything like a watch, but it was 1505. It only has an hour hand because it was not near accurate enough to keep time to the minute. Between 1505 and 1759, there were very few advancements in watches. Enter John Harrison, a carpenter turned clockmaker. The problem in his day was trying to find longitude at sea. All watches and clocks lost many seconds a day. He invented the first true chronometer, H4, for finding the longitude at sea. So we have the key wind watch. This is an English example, and this is an American example. And they took a key, a literal physical key that wound them. So the American watch, you would put it back here and wind it, and then you would open this and set the hands with the key. The same exact thing with the English watch. You open this and you set the hands, and you open the back and you wound it, and you had an extra key, so an extra thing. So if you lost this key, now you can't wind your watch until you buy another key. So these only really stayed around until about 1870. That's when they lost their popularity. However, American companies made watches until about 1893, just because they had some stock left over and they wanted to try to sell them. Now, English watches were sold into the early 1900s. I've seen them like 1903, 1905, 1907, somewhere around in there. So these held on for quite a while longer. I guess the British really love their key wind watches. So this is what I consider a real pocket watch. These came out, the stem wind and stem set. These came out in the late 1870s, early 1880s. That's when they caught on. Now, there were a few people who were making keyless wind watches before that, in the 1860s, 1850s, earlier, but they were more novelties. It wasn't until the late 1870s, early 1880s when the keyless watches or stem wind watches caught on. And these remain popular all the way, even to this day. We still have crowns on our watches. But what I'm gonna call real pocket watches stopped being produced in 1969. This is a Hamilton 992B, one of the last American railroad watches ever made, and they end in 1969. And you can still get pocket watches today that have mechanical movements, even from the 70s and the 80s and even today. And they also have quartz movements in them, but this is what we consider a real pocket watch, that the movement is as big as the case. And it was made by Hamilton. All this was made by Hamilton. And there were Elgin examples as well. So 1969 is really the very end of the last of the pocket watches. So this is a wristwatch. This has a mechanical movement and it's hand wound. You have to literally wind it. These became popular for men in the 19-teens during World War I. Before that, the pocket watch was king, period. So men started wearing these as fashion pieces, not really fashion pieces. They were needed for war because it was easier to look at your wrist than pull a pocket watch out of your pocket and put it back in. You know, you just glanced at your wrist and you knew it was time to attack. So hand wound mechanical watches for the wrist, or wristlets as they were called back then, became popular in the teens during World War I. Now in 1923, the bumper automatic wristwatch came out. This is a Universal Genève. I'm feeling it. There's a bumper in here. So there's a piece of metal there's springs on each side, and it's literally bumping against the spring, bumping against the spring, and that's how it's winding. So this came out in 1923, and later it was replaced by the rotor, which, as you can see here, this half moon piece, and as I shake it, you see it spins around, and so it's not going bump, 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 bump on your wrist. This is, every time you move, it spins, and it can go each direction. So it's a lot quieter, and this is what we still have to this day, is automatics with the rotor. So here we have a few examples of electric watches. These have a balance wheel in them, but they take a battery. So the battery keeps the balance wheel running instead of winding a spring up. Here is a Benris. Let's see if I can get it to work. So you see the second hand moving there, tick, 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 tick. But if I were to put a battery in here, it would tick all the time for as long as the battery had power. And you can see that's where the battery goes in that battery hatch. This is a Timex electric. Same thing, but when I shake it, watch the second hand, it goes one tick at a time. So it's mimicking what a quartz watch that would replace this later was doing. By going one tick at a time, it made it look like it was a quartz watch. This is another Timex electric, and as you can see, the second hand ticks just like a normal mechanical watch would. And this is also just another Timex electric with the 1 second sweep hand, 1 tick per second. So if you put batteries in these, they would run. Now these were out from 1957 with the Hamilton 500 until the 70s. Not exactly sure exactly when these went away. It's kind of hard to know, but these are the only type of watch that have never come back. I mean, you've still got pocket watches and mechanical watches, but the electric watches never came back in fashion. They just went out of style and they never came back. So this is the BULOVA ACCUTRON. This is also an electric watch, the same as these. But instead of these that use a balance wheel, this used a tuning fork. And it was an in-between stage in between an automatic watch and a quartz watch. So it has a literal tuning fork that vibrates back and forth, and it makes an audible hum. These were out from 1960 to 1977. Now, the ACCUTRON name still exists, but something like this does not exist with the tuning fork in it. They're automatic watches or they're quartz watches. They're just ACCUTRON in name only. As you can see, the seconds hand is extremely smooth when it sweeps. You don't see any jitter in there like you would with an automatic watch from the balance wheel going back and forth. This is just completely smooth because of the tuning fork. So I'm trying to get a sound example for you that you can hear it. And also I'm going to show you how it works. So here's a short clip of how it works. So these were out from, like I said, from 1960 to 1977, and then they don't make them anymore. The technology has been lost. These are getting older, harder to find in working condition, and even if they do work, they might need a tune-up anyway. And they're expensive to get repaired, but there are people out there that can repair them. And what my expensive is might not be what your expensive is, but they are worth it. I love these watches. I would suggest looking into them, and if you like them, buy one. So these are quartz analog watches. The first quartz watch to come out was in 1969 by Seiko. You can tell it's quartz, it ticks one tick at a second. I know that electric watch did too, but if you listen to that electric watch, you can hear the tick, 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 tick of the balance wheel. So it's just a faux 1 second tick. It's just manipulated to look like that. So as you can see, the ticking, the tick, tick. So these take what's called a power cell or battery, and you put it in here, and these will last a year or more, depending on the movement inside. This is a Japanese movement. This is a Swiss movement. And these are still prevalent today. In the 80s, the quartz watches nearly killed off the mechanical watches because they were cheaper and they could be more accurate than a mechanical watch. So these nearly killed off the mechanical watch, the automatics, and they're still around to this day. You can still buy a quartz movement even to this day. So the digital watch. You may think that this is a digital watch, and it is, but they actually came out in the early 1800s. There were pocket watches and wristwatches that had what were called digital times on them. But the first real digital watch that we would consider digital came out in 1972 by Pulsar. This is not a Pulsar 1972. This is a 1976 BULOVA, but it's the same concept. You see, there's nothing on the screen because it ate up a lot of battery power. You had to press this button to get it to show up, and then you could press it twice to get the date and press and hold to get the seconds. But that was all it could do. This ate up a lot of power. And then this is just a few years later, a 1980 Caravelle. It just doesn't have a battery in it, but this would display the time all the time. They got really inventive with these. This is a Seiko that has this world time and alarm. This is a Timex that would only show the time, same thing. You'd have to press the button to show the time. This is another Seiko alarm chronograph. So they got pretty wild with these. You could have anything from just the time to a chronograph, an alarm. But these are the digital watches. Like I said, the first modern one would have been from 1972, which cost several $1,000s. It cost over $2,100 back then. And that's not even adjusting for inflation. But by the end of the 70s, something like this would have only been $10, $20. So just a few years before, it would have been thousands. That's how we progress with our technology. The G-Shock. Now this, since it's my video, gets a special place because I've always loved the G-Shock. This is a 25th anniversary DW5025D. And yeah, you had digital watches like this, but you see how frail it is. It's made of metal. Some of them were made of, they had some plastic in them, and They were easy to break because they were so thin and lightweight. But the Casio G-Shock was made by Casio, obviously, in 1983. And it can take a beating because it was made to take a beating. They're 200-meter water resistance. The G supposedly stands for gravity shock. They have protection on them. These are made to withstand falling, beating. I mean, they're just tough watches as compared to something like this, that if you knock it too hard, you could probably knock the back off or break the screen or crack the LCD panel in there. That's not going to happen with this. So G-Shocks, have a special place in digital history. So we come to radio-controlled watches. In 1990, Youngins introduced this watch. This was the first radio-controlled watch. Today, we still have radio-controlled watches. This is a Casio G-Shock from the early 2000s, and they still make them even to this day. Seiko makes some, Citizen makes some, Casio makes some, and what they do, there's atomic clocks out there, and they're broadcasting a signal from a tower. Now here in America, that signal is coming from Denver, Colorado. So you have to make sure that your watch is facing north or south or east or west, wherever you are in relation to Denver, Colorado, and your watch will try to get a signal from that tower. You can force it to get a signal anytime by pressing and holding this button, and now it's trying to get a signal, a radio-controlled signal. But at 1 a.m., 3 a.m., and 5 a.m., it'll also try to get a signal, and it should get a signal by one or all three of those times, depending on where you have the watch. Generally, putting it in a window facing west, east, north, south, wherever you are in relation to Denver, Colorado is the best way to make it get a signal. It's not going to get a signal in an airplane or while you're driving down the road in your car. It's too much interference. Sometimes don't even work in the mountains. You have to find a place that's got a wide open space and has a good signal, good clear view of the sky. But Seiko, Citizen, Casio, a couple of other companies still make radio-controlled watches. You can still buy them today. Finally, we come to the smartwatch. They probably came out in the late 90s, but today they're very prevalent. You can buy anything from this, $10 watch that'll give you a few notifications like you got a message or your heart rate's too high, all the way up to the Apple Watch or the Samsung Galaxy Watch that'll give you much more information. Just depends on if you're an Android user or an Apple user. Also, Casio G-Shock makes a few watches that are smartwatches too. You can get certain signals on them, and also Michael Kors makes some, and other companies. They all make something similar to a smartwatch. So you can get something that's like a hybrid smartwatch that's like digital with a analog with a digital display, or purely digital. You can go all, and it'll tell you pretty much everything, and it keeps atomic time from your phone. We talked about these radio-controlled watches, and they're great, but once they're back on their regular quartz movement and they're not getting that signal anymore, they could potentially gain or lose seconds, whereas this is going to be continually checked by your phone, and Bluetooth is going to continually update these to be to the second with atomic time. So that's where we are today with watches. You can buy, any of these, but like I said, the electric watches are the ones they don't make anymore, but they make variants of pretty much everything else, and you can still buy pretty much anything else today. So thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. Have a great day.